Alright, peace and greetings YouTubers. So welcome to another edition of Music Talk. In this episode, we're talking all about New Jack Swing, one of my favorite eras in music. So let's jump right into it. Now I'm about to go very left field for this segment of the video, but I need you to stay with me because some of you are going to hear these names and be like, what? And be ready to close the video out, but I promise this is about to go somewhere, so stay with me, right? So we're actually going to jump back to 1989, and we're actually going to leave the United States and fly all the way over to South Korea, right? We're going to go visit Seoul. There's a man named Sateji and another man named Kangwane, who, by the way, don't know each other at all. They have nothing in common. The only similarity that they have is that they both have an obsession with a certain venue that exists in the Itaewon neighborhood of Seoul, South Korea. So what was so hot about Itaewon? Well, Itaewon was the area where the US troops used to hang out. It was a strip that had a lot of clubs and bars. It was actually called Hooker Hill. So, another conversation for another day. Anyway, with the different venues that were there, it was also a little segregated culturally because, you know, the white troops would go to their bars and their clubs and the black troops would go to theirs. And so there was a venue called the MoonNight nightclub. And this was the club where a lot of the black NCOs and GIs and the troops would go and party. Now, we have to remember, it's 1989. What is the popular genre that's taking place in 1989? What is this whole video about, right? New Jack Swing. In this club, all of the latest R&B, hip-hop, rap, and New Jack Swing tracks were blasting through these speakers. And so this was a club that was exclusive to the US troops. And so again, Sateji and Kangwane were obsessed with getting into this place. And then finally, they had the luck where they were able to get in. Now, they did not get in on the same day. Like I said, these are two very different individuals that have different lives, but they've just had the same experience. And so when they would get into this MoonNight nightclub, they would see things that they have never witnessed before. They would hear sounds that were just so foreign and so different from what was happening within the Korean music industry, where at this point in time, Korean folk was still really big. Something very left field, to the point where it's not even something that you can put in a conversation with what was happening with music in the United States, because sonically it was so different. And so they were mesmerized. They were obsessed. The sounds, the dance, the lingo, everything was different. There were dances that they would just kind of watch it and see how they could learn it. And they didn't even know what to call some of these things. There was something that they called the bunny dance, when in reality, the bunny dance was the Running Man, right? And so why does all of this matter? Who the F cares? Well, here's the thing. Sateji ended up becoming a member of the group Sateji and Boys, right? And they had a really popular song in South Korea and parts of Southeast Asia called I Know. And Kangwane used to be a member of a duo called Cologne, but also became a member of a group called Hyun Jin Young and Wawa. Why does that matter? These would become the pioneering acts of what today would be known as K-pop. The early remnants of what would become the massive blockbuster global genre of K-pop that the world has been obsessed with for the last few decades is rooted in the fact that its origins stem from two guys that were obsessed with the New Jack Swing that they heard at a nightclub. The very genre that has had a very massive expansion into the United States over the last decade. Now, it's been around for a really long time, but within the last decade, it's really blown up to the point where now acts are able to sell out SoFi Stadium in LA, right? That very genre owes its roots and origins to the fact that there were two random men that ended up at a nightclub and saw what black folks were doing with regard to New Jack Swing music and how obsessed they became. And understand that when we talk about those early groups out of the 1990s in the K-pop sound, understand that they studied and researched everything that these acts were doing. Everything from how they would sing certain songs, how the inflections in the voice would take place, the choreography, the dancing, the lingo, the style, the clothing, the haircuts, the swagger, all of it. They studied religiously. Like I said, Sateji and Kangwane, any chance that they had, they went into this club. And the reason why it mattered was because, again, everyday citizens from Korea were not allowed into this club. Somehow they were able to rub elbows and get favors and somehow get in there. And so these two become privy to an experience that's not only just the American experience, but the Black American experience. And one thing to remember is, again, this is 1989. This is when things are still very regional in the United States. And so when you take into account that you're having all these US troops coming from all these different cities in the United States, they're bringing their culture to this nightclub amongst themselves as they have this happy camaraderie of a party, right? And so so what these two would be seeing as far as what these black individuals were doing on the dance floor, you know, they're going to see all the regional dances and hear the regional songs that were coming out of Black Miami, Black Atlanta, Black Charlotte, Black DC, Baltimore, Philly, New York, Buffalo, Rochester, Chicago, Gary, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Houston, Dallas, New Orleans, Jackson, LA, Oakland, Seattle, Denver, all these different places. Understand that all these different places have their own regional sounds, their own regional languages as far as dialect and urban vernacular, right? Their own cultural style, the haircuts, the lingo. And so they're literally getting a crash course. And so the overabundance of culture in the MoonNight nightclub that these two would witness would serve as almost kind of like the study guide that they would utilize as they would create their K-pop groups in the early 1990s. And so if you go and look at what it was that these K-pop groups were doing, the entire style is that of what black Americans were doing at the time period. And it's rooted and influenced by what was happening with the culture that emerged out of New Jack Swing. If there's a word that I could use to describe New Jack Swing, that word would be explosive, because when you think about it, New Jack Swing is something that exploded into the music scene. It was big, it was bright, it was energetic, it was in your face. When you're talking about the musicality, it was rooted in all things in relation to black culture. And not only was it just a sound, it was a movement. It would carry influence in all kind of things like fashion, TV, film, lingo, even hair. And when we talk about the influence that it had when it came to the dance world, and the influence that it would have in the music industry as far as serving as the glue that would marry R&B and hip hop together, right? There were so many layers that New Jack Swing contributed. And when we're talking about nightlife, New Jack Swing was something that shifted the world of nightlife when it came to the club scene. Understand that arguably one of the best times to have been in the club scene would have been during the golden era of New Jack Swing. Some people may say disco, some people may say during the funk era, some people may say during the EDM era. In my personal opinion, I would definitely say the New Jack Swing era, because this is a time period where everybody danced. This to me seems like one of the funnest moments that ever would have existed for people in nightlife, because it's a far contrast from the current era where, you know, people go and you spend all the money on the section and then you spend $400 on a bottle and you pretend that you're having a good time with the hookah. Nothing like that existed, because there were no sections. There was a dance floor and people used it. One of the things I've always said about black music is that it's always served as the soundtrack to what was happening in the United States. And one of the things historically that's always taken place in the United States is that anytime there's an era of economic downturn or periods of uncertainty or hardship or tragedy or panic, there's always a shift in the culture. And a lot of times that shift takes place in music, because people are often yearning for the contrast to whatever that trigger is, where people want that void filled. And what I mean by that is people are looking for escapism. People are looking for something that takes their attention away from whatever is taking place. And as we come out of these different time periods that kind of bring everybody's energy down, people are looking for something that's going to bring them back up. So can we take a trip down memory lane? If we go to the 1920s, as we come into the 1920s, this is a time period where the United States has just come out of Spanish flu, in addition to coming out of World War I. There's been millions of people who have died. There's been lots of tragedy and hardship, economic downturn. And so musically, what was happening? Blues was there, and blues was a great way to, you know, kind of showcase and show people exactly what was happening through the language of music. But on the contrast, when people needed to dance, when people needed to really get out and get their energy out, jazz became a thing. We get the roaring 20s. Jazz becomes this sound that just saturates the nation, right? Because it's bright, it's bold, it's unapologetic, it's black, it's sexy, it's everything. And so it becomes this massive, massive genre that pretty much defines the 1920s musically. And then we get to the 1930s. And the United States is going through the worst of the Great Depression. In addition to the fact that the Great Depression wasn't even limited to just the United States, it was a global catastrophe. And so the United States is going through the era of Hoovervilles, where people are literally building their homes out of whatever they can scrape together. This is the era of breadlines. People need escapism. So on that music side, we see the emergence of swing. We see swing get a lot bigger, right? We see the return of ragtime. Now, ragtime had been popular since the 1890s, but it was a genre that kind of had its ups and downs, where it would peak and then kind of decline, and now it was on the peak again because people needed to move. People needed to do something that made them feel good. In addition to that, the soundtracks for musicals became very, very popular. And in addition to that, radio has now become a thing, right? Radio starts to emerge in the 1920s, and by the time we get to the 1930s, nearly every American household has a radio in their home. And so for people who are in financial hardship, who could not afford to go and buy every vinyl that came out, they could now listen to the radio and hear all their favorite songs. And music has also become something that is more interactive, where it's not just about sitting and listening, but now dances are being associated with the specific genres. And then we get to the 1940s. This is the era of World War II. Right? An even bigger war than World War I, where we're watching millions and millions of people die. We're watching so many get drafted and not come back. This is the era of rationing. This is the era of making sure that everything is good on the home front. And so because of that, we see lots of changes. Now, in a previous episode, I talk about the music strike that takes place between 1942 and 1944, as well as an additional strike between 1948 and 1949. And we also talk about the shortage of shellac and some of the issues that took place within music. So again, what does that mean when you have 136,000 musicians represented by the American Federation of Musicians that decide we're not putting out any new music? Nothing will come out. You have a lot of artists who are hungry. There's two things happening. In addition to the fact that we said there's now a ban on music being released between 1942 and 44, as well as 1948 and 1949, people have to literally listen to the same thing. So people are finding creative ways to make that experience more enhanced. And so like we said with the 1930s, those new dance crazes continue to come out. And so ragtime still is holding on, right? Ragtime is still popular, right? And then again, big bands have now become even more popular. So you have those different things taking place. But at the same time, because so many artists have not been releasing new music because of the ban and the strike, there's this time period for creativity. And so as we come out of those moments, there's some nuggets that come out during the 1940s. You have Li Ba Ba La Ba by Helen Humes that comes out in August of 1945. You have My Gal's a Jockey by Big Joe Turner that comes out in January of 1946. In 1946, Choo Choo Cha Boogie comes out by Louis Jordan. In September of 1946 as well, you have Gotta Give Me What You Got by Julia Lee and her boyfriends. In July of 1947, you have He's a Real Gone Guy by Nellie Letcher. And then there's the second music striking ban that ends in 1949. And so by that February, you have Sticks McGee and his buddies that dropped the song Drinkin' Wine, Spo D.O.D. You also have, in May of 1949, Jimmy Preston and his Prestonians Rock the Joint. And by 1950, you'd also have Ruth Brown release Teardrops From My Eyes. Now, why do we just spend time highlighting those specific songs? Well, these would be the songs that would have the early remnants of what eventually would become the rock and roll of the 1950s. And if there was a song that I think predates all of those that somewhat kicked off that initial origin of that distinctive sound, but because of that first music ban, it kind of gets left out of the conversation because it came out in 1941, I would definitely say Rock Daniel by Lucky Millinder and his orchestra with Rosetta Tharpe. So the 1940s would serve as a very transitional period. And again, this is all centered around music that made people want to dance. And at the same time, country western has also become really, really popular in the 1940s. And then we get into the 1950s. And though we've made it out of World War II, we've jumped right back into some more shenanigans because now we're in the middle of the Cold War. Right? There's that fear that the Great White Flash is coming any day now. People are building bomb shelters and bunkers on their homes, right? This is the time period where, in addition, we also jump into the Korean War. And there's also a massive polio outbreak in 1952. And in addition to that, in the United States, things are not that great amongst the different demographics because this is some of the worst time period when it comes to Jim Crow laws. And when we talk about the emergence of what was going to happen with the Civil Rights Movement because of so many atrocities like Emmett Till and different things that were taking place at that time. However, on the music side, rock and roll has exploded into the scene. And we talk about rock in a different episode from this series entitled Race in the Music Industry. And so definitely check that episode out. But rock and roll becomes this massive, massive genre that takes the United States by storm. And again, that conversation of an interactive experience. Now, not only do you have radio to enjoy this on, but television has started to have its legs, right? We've seen the emergence of American Bandstand in the Ed Sullivan Show, where now there's a visual to support what it is that's being presented, in addition to the fact that you have these dance crazes that's taken over the nation. Things like the twist, where music is becoming more of a collective experience, not just with the listening, but with the activity that comes with it. And then we get into the 1960s, where that economic prosperity of the booming 50s that people love to celebrate is starting to come into question as we come into the 1960s, because that American dream is starting to become evident that it's not attainable for everybody living in America. And the Civil Rights Movement has become bigger. The Black Liberation Movement has become bigger. And sadly, at the same time, we've seen the assassination of many leaders within the community. You've seen the assassination of Martin Luther King. We've seen what happened with Medgar Evers. We see what happens with Malcolm X. In addition to that, on the political side, we see the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and we see the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. All these different moments that have taken place in the 60s of tragedy. And in addition to the fact that we're still in the Cold War, we've jumped into the Vietnam War. And there's civil unrest, there's protests because they've also brought back the draft, and they're sending these random 18 and 19-year-olds to go and fight for a war in a country that most people have never even heard of at the time. And so there's so many things happening, especially along the lines of race in the United States. However, when it came to that conversation of music, when people needed that escapism, there were so many options because so much was happening musically. We saw what was happening with rock, and we saw the emergence of the British invasion and what was happening with the Beatles. But on that other side of the parallel, when it came to music that got people on the dance floor, when people were going to shake a shoulder and shake a hip and sweat it out all night, it was the sound of what was happening with Stax Records, right? Albums like Johnny Taylor's Who's Making Love, those kind of projects that got people dancing. What was happening with funk music and what James Brown was bringing to the table, and also what was happening with Motown and how Motown became literally the soundtrack of American teenagers and American dance floors and American black households as far as what got people to dance. What was it that made people feel good? The sound of Motown was ear candy, and it was something that just was euphoric and just pulled people in, and it was this machine that you just could not escape. And so in the 1960s, there were so many moments where the trend continued to shift, and there were so many different things that brought people to the dance floor that made people forget about what was happening in those moments just for that 30 or 40 minutes where they were out dancing, or maybe an hour. You know, some escapism from the nonsense of the real world. Just that moment to feel free, that moment to just let the music live through them. That was the 60s. Plus some drugs. And then as we come into the 1970s, for young adults who have just completed a childhood of assassinations and the threat of nuclear war, as well as a heroin epidemic that's still lasting well into the 1970s, these become adults who still end up watching their peers get drafted into the Vietnam War, as well as watching the addition and the rise of crime, and also watch the emergence of more political corruption. And so people need escapism because the economy is not really doing that great in the 1970s. It's very wishy-washy. People need escapism. So much is happening. The cost of college is starting to get higher. There's so many different things that are taking place. People need something to escape to. And so in the musical landscape, people needed escapism. Yes, they could sit with the Joni Mitchell lyrics and think about how much the world sucks, but at the same time, when they were ready to dance, oh, we get the emergence of disco. And funk becomes even more expansive into what it does, right? As far as everything happening with P-Funk. And so you have P-Funk and you have the disco era. And the dance floors are full. People need escapism from all the nonsense happening in the real world. And so people emerge into spaces like Studio 54 and all these discotheque clubs where, again, people can just feel free. And this is a genre that is massive. It reflects on just the overall anxiety and stress that Americans have about the world. And this is a place where they can escape. And so disco is massive. And then we get to those 80s. It's the era of Reaganomics. It's the era of watching the gap between the wealthy and the poor only get wider and wider and wider. It's the era of watching crime increase even more. It's the era of crack. It's the era of AIDS. It's the era of so many different things that take place. And people need escapism. People need something that just really takes their mind off of whatever's happening. And like we said, when you have those moments of hardship and uncertainty and periods where things just don't quite align, it also creates an era of creativity. And that's what we would see as we come into the mid-80s with the emergence of New Jack Swing. So even when it came to the element of dance and the club scene and nightlife, between about 1981 going into 1985, there was somewhat of a void that existed in the dance scene when we're talking about what was happening at the clubs and what got Americans to get up and dance. Because to an extent, there was the missing presence of black artists. Now, I don't want people to get confused. Black music was still being played. There was lots of stuff that was commercially successful. However, when we talk about that element of what was happening in music at that time, we can't have this conversation without reflecting back to what happened as a result of the Disco Sucks movement. Now, we've talked about the Disco Sucks movement in my So What Happened episode with Janet Jackson, and so definitely check out that episode with regard to the origin of that story. But in the context of this episode, what I want to highlight is this. One of the things that would end up taking place is because so many radio programmers were afraid of playing black music, there were a lot of black artists that were left out of the picture from the commercial realm. They were still racking up a lot of hits on the black singles charts, or what would have been deemed the R&B charts of that era, but there were a lot of black artists that did not get the same visibility that some of the major artists of that era would get. So can we backtrack a little bit? Now, when we go into the 1970s, the radio stations are still in an AM format, and as we get to the late 1970s, FM frequency is introduced. with the introduction of FM frequency, now we're starting to get different radio formats where everything is not just top 40. Back in the AM days, everything's top 40. Whatever's the top 40 songs in the country, that's what they're gonna play. Now there's options because there's more frequencies, there's more stations, and so now we're getting genre-specific stations. And one of the biggest genres that popped up and became a format that was all over the country as far as an overabundance of stations was disco. And so disco was everywhere. I mean, you could be in the middle of nowhere on a road trip, okay? Nearest gas station 60 miles away. But I bet you could find a disco radio station somewhere. You got to be real. Like, you was gonna find it, okay? And so when we get to that era of the backlash in the disco sucks movement, all these radio programmers start getting nervous because they're like, we don't want to lose our audience. And so they start changing their formats. And this is because they knew that if they lost their audience, they lose sponsors, they lose advertising. That means they lose money. So literally overnight, as we have the whole disco backlash movement, a lot of these stations that were disco hits all day, all night, start changing formats, and they start changing over to pop. They start changing over to rock. They start changing over to country. They change to all these different formats. And unfortunately, a lot of these stations, especially in places where there were not very large black populations, there weren't a lot of stations in some of those areas that were changing to R&B or soul or funk. They went the other way. And then the other thing is, as they shifted from disco to rock or country or pop or easy listening and adult contemporary, they made sure that they were not going to play anything that had too much extra grit, kick, or funk, because it would be too close to the idea and the sound of disco. And again, it's the era of disco sucks. They don't want that kind of smoke. They don't want to lose their money. And so what ends up happening is you have a lot of black acts that are making some great music. And again, in the black spectrum of the music industry, on the black singles charts, they're having a great time. You know, acts like the Gap Band and Evelyn Champagne King and Zapp and The Time and Shalimar and D-Train, Rick James, Midnight Star, Atlantic Star, New Edition, Gwen Guthrie, Shannon. We could name artist after artist, and during that time there were so many black artists that were making music that people could really dance to and get down to. But there was an entire segment of America that was missing out because that music was not getting the same commercial exposure. And it also doesn't help that this is the era of the emergence of MTV. And we've seen the backstory with MTV and how they didn't play black videos. But even after they started playing Michael Jackson and Prince, they really didn't start playing a lot of black music well until almost 1986, if we really want to have that conversation. Because again, they still had the argument of the music needs to fit the format of rock and roll on TV. And so when it came to a lot of 80s funk artists, they were out of the picture. Now MTV would slowly become a little receptive to some of the rappers that were out at the time, but when it came to those acts like an Evelyn Champagne King, they weren't playing her. You know, 81, 82, 83, 84, don't worry about it. You're not going to get any kind of play on our station. And so you saw the backlash with both radio and things like MTV. And what made it even interesting is the argument would be your sound is just it mirrors too much of disco. It's too close to that genre that's no longer cool anymore. But then they play something like David Bowie, Let's Dance. They play something like Madonna, Holiday, which, again, these are songs that have a very similar setup sonically, where it's pretty much almost that same sound, but there's a different face making the music. And so radio and MTV are more receptive to that. And so for a lot of black artists during this time period that were able to get songs that would cross over commercially that you could actually dance to, one of the things that was very noticeable was the fact that a lot of these songs weren't really rooted in the R&B funk soul sound. They were a lot more pop oriented. Because like we said in the So It Happened episode with Janet Jackson, when it came to getting those crossover songs, you either had to go adult contemporary or go very, very pop. And so when you look at some of the songs that did cross over from black artists, and again, this is not a one-size-fits-all because there would be anomalies. I'm just talking about a pattern. Because you'd have songs like Chaka Khan, I Feel For You, which was a really, really big hit, peaked at number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100, and this was a very, very funky song, R&B rooted, soulful, even had elements of hip-hop in it. So there were going to be exceptions to the rule. But when you look at the pattern, songs like Lionel Richie, All Night Long. Now, one of the things Lionel did during this time period, when we're talking early 80s to the mid 80s, he stayed dropping an easy listening tune, okay? All Night Long is the anomaly because this is the era where Lionel Richie did not believe in a bass guitar and a bass riff. Everything was easy listening, okay? He was gonna go from Stuck on You to Hello, right? There were no more brick houses in the catalog. So, you know, Lionel Richie That was his thing, you know, all night long. Denise Williams, Let's Hear It for the Boy. A very fun, upbeat, bright song, but very pop-oriented. Even the delivery of the song and the way that she sings it is very whimsical, right? Something that would make it easily digestible for audiences across all of America, right? That was kind of the approach. Diana Ross, Why Do Fools Fall in Love, her remake of the Frankie Lyman and the Teenager song. Again, very bright, very whimsical, but it has this approach where it doesn't have that grit that you'd normally get. And again, I'm not dissing any of these songs. I'm just pointing out a pattern that we see, right? Even something as great as like a Whitney Houston, How Will I Know? An amazing pop song, an amazing vocal delivery, but when you're talking about the dynamics of the song, it's a song that's a lot more pop-oriented in comparison to some of the other songs that would have been out by artists that were releasing tracks that were a little bit more funkier. But again, it was Whitney Houston, she could sing the phone book, it was going to be a hit either way. Ray Parker Jr., Ghostbusters, right? That was a really, really big one. And again, we're not dissing these songs, but we're just highlighting the fact that in order for these songs to cross over, they had to be digestible by white America. And what I'm getting at is this. If we were to go during the same era and go to a club in Baltimore, or go to a club in Chicago, or go to a club in Brooklyn, I can guarantee you that the dance floor was not clearing out when Morris Day and the Times' Jungle Love or The Bird came on, and then they were running to the dance floor when Ghostbusters came on. It was most likely the other way around. I'm speaking of the black clubs, if you haven't caught my drift at this point. Donna Summer, She Works Hard for the Money. Another one, a really big crossover hit. And again, when you're talking about just the build-up and the makeup of the songs, listen to how different these songs are sonically in comparison to a lot of the songs that the 80s funk artists or the 80s soul and R&B acts were dropping that were danceable, that were doing really well on the black singles charts and the R&B charts. In order for people to cross over with a song that you could dance to, it had to fit the mold of what was popular in the United States at the time. What are some songs that were popular during this time period? Well, you had songs like Abracadabra by the Steve Miller Band, Eye of the Tiger by Survivor, Maneater by Hall & Oates, Carla Boniff, Personally, The Kinks, Come Dancin', UB40's Red, Red Wine, that was a big one. Kaja Go-Go's Too Shy. Now, I will say, you could shake a little bit of shoulder to that one. That one had a little bit of kick to it. Kenny Loggins' Footloose. 99 Love Balloons by Nena. Cyndi Lauper's Girls Just Wanna Have Fun. And again, I'm just naming some of the really popular songs that people danced to between about 1982 to about 83, 84, right? Those are kind of the songs. So a lot of times for black artists that wanted to cross over, they had to kind of fit into that same mold. If it had too much grit, like what Rick James was doing around 1983, 84, it wasn't gonna fly commercially. But again, when it came to the black singles charts and what was happening with black radio, you know, these songs are getting eaten up. But again, it's just showing that there was somewhat of a void that existed during this time period. Now, we get to New Jack Swing. Now, when it comes to the origin of the New Jack Swing sound, there are 7 songs that I want to highlight. And the first 6 songs all come out within an 18-month period. The very first song I want to highlight is from Junior Giscombe. You may know him from the song Mama Used to Say. But in 1985, he releases a single entitled Oh Louise. Now, the thing about this song, this is a song that Teddy Riley credits as being the very first New Jack Swing song, as well as drummer Lenny White. And the reason they give the song the element of that credit is not because it would be the song that would create the element of New Jack Swing as we know it, but more so because this is that first song that has that element of that swing beat, right? The swing beat was something that you could often pull from the Lindrum. Now, if you're a really big Prince fan, you recognize the Lindrum on songs like 17 Days or Apollonia's Six Sex Shooter. Oh Louise wouldn't really be a big hit. It would not chart in the US, but it would be somewhat of a minor hit in the UK. It also didn't necessarily measure up to the tempo of what we know New Jack Swing as. However, this is that first song where you hear an element of that swing beat. Also in 1985, Full Force would release the single Alice, I Want You Just For Me. This is another song that's also been credited with being the first New Jack Swing song, and this song would gain a little bit more traction, peaking at number 16 on the R&B charts and number 9 on the UK charts. And again, this was another song where you hear that element of that New Jack Swing beat as far as the swing sound. And on August 13th of 1985, Dougie Fresh releases The Show, which was produced by Teddy Riley. And this also gets credit as being one of the pioneering songs for the New Jack Swing sound. This would be a song that would peak at number 4 on the black singles charts. And because this song contains so many elements of black music, everything from funk to go-go, this would be the song that I think started to serve as the manual for how a lot of songs that would be labeled New Jack Swing would start to be constructed. Then in 1986, Janet Jackson releases the single Nasty. Now the thing about Nasty is that it was recorded in September of 1985, 1 month after the release of the show from Dougie Fresh. So you're starting to see that the influence of this sound is starting to gain legs and it's starting to gain traction. Nasty would be that first song that has a massive commercial success on the pop charts as far as a song that has somewhat of that swing beat. It's not necessarily that New Jack swing beat that people associate with acts like Guy or Keith Sweat, but it is one of those first songs as well that has that swing beat that's now getting into a commercial space. Nasty would peak at number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100. Also in 1986, Kool Moe Dee releases the single Go See the Doctor. This song would peak at number 89 on the Billboard Hot 100, and again, this was another song that had that swing beat. Now, it was a little bit slower than what people associate with New Jack Swing, but again, that beat was there, and we're going to talk about that beat in a second. And then as we get into 1987, there's the song Rap's New Generation by the Classical 2. Of all the songs named so far, this is the song that really has that sound that people would associate with that early wave of New Jack Swing between about 1986 into 1987. Teddy Riley would also state that this would be the song that would set off the New Jack Swing wave. And the last song I want to highlight is I Want Her from Keith Sweat that comes out in 1987. Now, just like Rap's New Generation by the Classical 2, this is another song that really has that swing beat, and this is a song that I think people really associate the sound of New Jack Swing with. When people think of New Jack Swing, this is one of the songs that people immediately think of. And the only difference between this song and the song by the Classical 2 is more so the tempo. Rap's New Generation is a little bit slower and is more in a pocket. I Want Her is more of a groove that's a little bit faster, and I think it's that sound and the combination of what was happening with Rap's New Generation plus the other songs that were listed that really stir the pot in regard to the conversation of what really kicks off New Jack Swing. So when it comes to that swing beat, that's all about what can you percussively do in between your 1 and your 4 of your rhythm, right? So if we have a song and it's going 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and most New Jack Swing songs were about at a 120 beats per minute ratio as far as the beat, right? That's normally the speed, about 120 beats per minute. So if we're going 1, 2, 3, 4, normally your 1s and your 3s are where you're going to have your downbeat. Boom, 2, boom, 4, boom, 2, boom, 4. And normally your highs or your claps or your snare or tambourine or whatever you hit, the claps or whatever at the end, that's normally on your 2s and your 4s. So normally you're getting boom, ka, boom, ka, boom, ka, boom, ka. When it comes to a swing beat, it's all about what percussive thing can you do in between the 1 and the 4. The 1 of that initial kick drum that you first hit and that 4 of that last high that you emphasize. So if we take Keith Sweat's I Want Her, the beat on that song, if we're doing this 1, 2, 3, 4 thing, their beat is going boom, ka, boom, boom, ka, boom, ka, boom, ka, boom, ka, boom, boom, and then it starts back over, right? And so the thing about it is, because there's so much happening in between the 1 and the 4, it makes the beat pull or makes the beat swing, where your 1 and your 4 is not really a sound of completion, but it's a sound of continuation. So on a lot of songs that are not New Jack Swing, the emphasis is more so on the 2s and the 4s, because 2s and the 4s is where we clap. That's kind of where most songs kind of keep their heart of their rhythm, right? On that 2 and the 4, as far as people who are clapping along, right? The 1s and the 3s are still going to be your drums, but with that, the emphasis is not on the 1 and the 4, right? If we're on the 1 and the 4, we'd be boom, boom, right? And so when it comes to New Jack Swing, it's all about everything that happens in between that 1 and that 4. And again, there wasn't a one-size-fits-all rule when it came to the production of New Jack Swing. I know we spent a lot of time talking about what happens between the 1 and the 4, but again, anything could happen between the 1 and the 4, and that's one of the reasons why New Jack Swing was a sound that was able to evolve so many times within a really rapid time span. When we're talking about that 10-year window of New Jack Swing, just look at how different the sound is as we go from 85 to 87, 88 to 89, 90 to 92, 93 to 95. Very, very, very different sounds. As a matter of fact, even the clip that we just utilized of Bobby Brown, now that clip is actually from 1991. That's him performing the song Tap Into My Heart. But when you compare it against that Keith Sweat clip that we utilized, you can just hear how different the songs are sonically with production. Same energy, same pull, but very different production styles. And that was one of the benefits of something like New Jack Swing. There wasn't really a full set of rules, and there was so many ways that you could expand. It was all about what can your percussive ear do that's going to get people to a dance floor and get people moving, right? And kind of keep that energy. Like we said, as long as you had some element of that swing beat, the beat could swing, but there weren't rules about what had to happen while the beat was swinging. And so again, this is why New Jack Swing had so many different sounds. And one of the interesting things too that I want to hop into is the fact that by the time we get to 1985 to 1987, and by the way, this would not even necessarily be the peak of New Jack Swing. This is still the early building block years. As a matter of fact, New Jack Swing wouldn't even have an official title until 1988, and that would be because Barry Michael Cooper from The Village Voice was writing an article about Teddy Riley, and then he coined the term Teddy Riley's New Jack Swing. So when we're talking 1985 to 1987, this is more so a period of transformative years, and it wasn't just for New Jack Swing, but it was just for music in general, because again, there was a shift taking place in the music industry. If you follow me, you know I love having these conversations about shifts that take place. Now, like I said earlier, we had just come out of this era with the backlash to the disco sucks movement, where radio programmers are afraid to play music that has too much grit, too much funk, might be deemed a little too black, too soulful, so send it over to the R&B radio programmers and let them play it. MTV, their rule was, we are only playing what we feel can be deemed as rock and roll on TV. We don't want to play all that other stuff y'all got. See, we heard there's a new network called BET. Send it to them, maybe they'll play it, right? That was kind of the wave that was happening. But by the time we get to 85, going into 86 and 87, America's palette has shifted, right? Because the thing about musical ears is that people always want something new, always want something fresh. Just like with food, you don't want to keep eating the same thing all the time. You expand and try new things. And so by the time we get to 85, 86, 87, the sounds had really expanded into new realms and into new trends. And so when we're looking at music specifically from black artists, black producers that made people get up and dance, there wasn't just one trend that was out. There were a handful, or more than a handful of trends that were out that were kind of the dominant sound around this time. And so, of course, you had the emergence of hip-hop and rap music that was doing its thing. And so that's starting to spread and get its legs by the time we get to 85, 86, 87. But it wasn't just that. You also had house music, which had been thumping and jumping since the late 70s. If you want to have that conversation about Freddie Knuckles and what was happening in 1977 and what was happening at the Warehouse and in Chicago and even down the street in Detroit with the techno sound, all of that had been going on, right? And so by the time we get to 85, 86, 87, radio is more receptive to house music and things are starting to change a little bit. And one of the other things I want to also note is, though we've had this conversation about radio kind of pushing people out or MTV saying no to a lot of folks, the other conversation that we can't leave out is the fact that you've always had the presence of underground clubs. You've also had the presence of college radio stations. You've also had the presence of different music heads that found different spaces where they could connect and could, you know, get into different sounds that may not necessarily be as commercial. So it wasn't like there was a full blackout and nobody had access to the sounds. They were there for the people who wanted them. So again, we had hip hop, we had house, techno was doing its thing. The Minneapolis sound was a thing. And the Minneapolis sound was very expansive because, again, you had Prince and what he was doing with all of his different proteges like the Sheila E's and the Vanity Six and Apollonia Six, and then you also had the branching off of people that worked with him that were also producers. So then you also had what happened with Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis and how they would produce for Alexander O'Neal and Sherelle and the SOS Band and Janet. And going back to that Minneapolis sound again, you still had what was happening with Morris Day and The Time and all these acts that were coming out of that specific range of sound between 85 and 87, where that was starting to really become a staple when it came to what people really like to dance to. And you had acts like Ready for the World who had songs like Oh Sheila that were out where that sound was really popular. A lot of people like to credit that sound to the Minneapolis sound, but Ready for the World will tell you, hey, we weren't from Minneapolis, we were from Michigan, right? And so that was a really, really popular sound. It's very interesting to see what was kind of just coming out of that region of the country when we're talking about Minnesota, Michigan, Ohio, Chicago, Indiana. Like, there's a whole lot happening on that side, because then you also still have what's happening with Zapp and Roger, who again are from Ohio. They had been rattling and shaking the table since the early 80s, and by the time we get to 85, 86, 87, that sound is also a staple on dance floors. The Calloway brothers also have a distinctive sound that's starting to become popular. These were the brothers that initially were in the group Midnight Star, and now they're producing for other artists, and they've just given a group like Levert a big hit with the song Casanova. Babyface is really getting his footing as a producer. He's just produced the song Rocksteady for the Whispers. Rick James has had a string of hits since the 70s, and now that we're in the mid-80s, he's still racking out solo hits, but also giving hits to other acts, and so he's working with people like Smokey Robinson and Eddie Murphy and the Mary Jane Girls. Foster and McElroy are getting really popular with their sound and the things that they've done for acts like Social Timex Club and Club Nouveau, and they would later go on to produce acts like In Vogue and Tony, and a lot of acts in the 90s and the early 2000s. Angela Winbush is not only making hits for herself, but she's also still producing for different acts like Stephanie Mills and the Isley Brothers. Quincy Jones, who at this point has been associated with literally every genre in music by the time we get to 85, 86, 87, is still pushing innovative boundaries by getting into the studio and working on the Michael Jackson Bad album. And so when we look at the bigger picture, there are all these different sounds. And mind you, this was more so just the black side. We didn't talk about what was happening on the pop side of what people were jamming and getting down to, because at this point, now they're partying to New Shoes, I Can't Wait. At this point, everybody's trying to shake a shoulder. But when we put it all together as far as those different sounds that we were talking about, and mind you, I didn't even cover every sound, and there's also a conversation about regionally what was happening, because there were going to be a lot of sounds that stayed local that never quite crossed over commercially, mainly due to the fact that this is before the time period of everybody being on synchronized national radio playlists. And so sometimes you could be a really, really big artist in your local area, but you might not cross over to the rest of the country, but you'd have a respectable career within the regions that you live in. And so 85 to 87 is a very transformative period where you have all these different sounds vying to be that dominant force within music. And what ends up happening by the time you start transitioning into 88 is that all of these sounds actually kind of start merging together, and New Jack Swing serves as the basis, because what you start to notice is even a lot of the people that we've highlighted, whether it's Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis or Babyface or Foster and McElroy, they all still have their distinctive sounds, but as you look into the productions that they have later down the line, a lot of them are more saturated around the idea of New Jack Swing. And so what you end up getting is New Jack Swing songs that have elements of the Minneapolis sound, that have elements of house, that have elements of what Calloway was doing, that have elements of what Full Force was doing, that have elements of what Prince was doing, or Rick James, or a lot of the people that I was not able to name. And so New Jack Swing is such an expansive sound that it's very appeasing to so many different audiences. And so New Jack Swing really becomes this genre that is a collage of so many sounds blended together: gospel, R&B, soul, funk, go-go, rap, hip-hop, house, techno, all these different bits, and I'm skipping some, but all these different bits of elements, you hear them in a lot of the New Jack Swing songs. And that's why when you think of some of the biggest New Jack Swing hits, a lot of them sound nothing like the other.
Description of me, 6'1" and dark and lovely. And if to say I'm black and beautiful is true, not phony, I'm prouder than Bobby, so won't you be my tender Bodie?
Some people think I'm not, some people think I'm nasty. And if you really want to know just like me, then I'll say I'm nasty.
Then just let me sleep.
So fine, so fine, so fine.
Me some time, now I realize it's you, the home where I belong.
Because there were so many options. They have the same energy, they had that same kind of grit that makes you want to get up and dance, but when you listen to a lot of the songs, production-wise, New Jack Swing goes into so many directions as we go into 1988 and 1989. 1988 and 1989 would serve as what I call the Great Awakening when it came to the commercial appeal of New Jack Swing. We get a lot of notable projects and releases during this time period. In 1988, we'd see hits emerge from acts like The Boys with Dial My Heart, The Mac Band, Roses Are Red, Surface, I Missed, I'll Be Sure, Off on Your Own Girl, Johnny Kemp, Just Got Paid, EU, The Butt, Kid and Play, Do This My Way, Levert, Just Coolin', Loose Ends, Watching You, MC Hammer, Let's Get It Started, Salt and Pepper, Shake Your Thing, Tony, Born Not to Know, and Little Walter, Vanessa Williams, The Right Stuff, Rob Bass and DJ Easy Rock, It Takes Two, and Joy and Pain, just to name a few. And if I could highlight a handful of albums coming out of 1988, we definitely have to talk about Guy's Guy album. This is an album that would spawn the singles Round and Round, Merry-Go-Round of Love, Groove Me, Teddy's Jam, I Like, and Spend the Night. Guy was a group that would consist of Teddy Riley, Aaron Hall, Damian Hall, as well as Timmy Gatling. And many of their songs would serve as what you call the soundtrack to New Jack Swing. In addition, we definitely have to highlight New Edition's Heartbreak album. This album would spawn the singles If It Isn't Love, You're Not My Kind of Girl, Can You Stay in the Rain, Crucial, and Any Heartbreak. Karen White's Karen album would also be a popular album in 1988 as well, spawning the singles The Way You Love Me, Superwoman, Love Saw It, Secret Rendezvous, and Slow Down. And we'd also have to talk about the Keith Sweat album, Make It Last Forever. Now, it did come out in 1987, however, the majority of the run would be in 1988. And this album would spawn the singles I Want Her, Something Just Ain't Right, Make It Last Forever, and Don't Stop Your Love. But there's no way to talk about 1988 without highlighting Bobby Brown's Don't Be Cruel album, which would be the biggest selling R&B album of 1989, spawning hit singles like Don't Be Cruel, My Prerogative, Roni, Every Little Step, and Rock With You. This would be an album that would eventually go on to sell 12 million records worldwide. Fun fact, both the Bobby Brown album and the New Edition album were released on the same day by MCA Records. Initially, the label wasn't 100% sure exactly which album would be the bigger commercial success. A lot of money was riding on the New Edition album because they now had their second lineup change and they had worked with some new producers. Plus, they were coming off of somewhat of a career slowdown after the release of the Under the Blue Moon album. And Bobby Brown's debut album, King of the Stage, wasn't the massive commercial success. However, it still garnered a #1 R&B hit with Girlfriend, as well as a moderately successful R&B hit with Girl Next Door. The New Edition album would debut at number 101 on the Billboard 200 and eventually peak at number 12 on the Billboard 200. And Bobby Brown's album would debut at number 74 on the Billboard 200 and eventually peak at number 1 6 months after its release. In 1989, we'd see the continued success with songs like I'll Be Sure's If I'm Not Your Lover, Karen White's Secret Rendezvous, Babyface, It's No Crime, Keith Sweat, Don't Stop Your Love, The Gap Band, All My Love, Bobby Brown, On Our Own, Today, Girl I Got My Eyes on You, After 7, Heat of the Moment, Al Green, As Long As We're Together, Big Daddy Kane, I Get the Job Done, Christopher Williams, Talk to Myself, Chucky Booker, Turned Away, Diana Ross, Working Overtime, Too Hype, In Touch, Full Force, Ain't My Type of Hype, The Good Girls, Your Sweetness, Guy, My Fantasy, Jody Watley, Friends, and Real Love, Kid and Play, Rollin' with Kid and Play, Kool Moe Dee, They Want Money. I'd also like to highlight that in 1987, Kool Moe Dee would have 2 additional New Jack Swing hits with How You Like Me Now and Wild Wild West. Quincy Jones, I'll Be Good to You, Randy Jackson and the Gypsies, Perpetrators and Love You Honey, Redhead Kingpin, Do the Right Thing and Pump It Hottie, Soul to Soul, Back to Life, Rex in Effect, New Jack Swing, Young MC, Bust a Move, Sky, Start of a Romance, DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince, I Think I Can Beat Mike Tyson, The Jacksons, Nothing Compares to You. And if there were several very successful albums to come out of 1989, we definitely have to highlight Babyface's Tender Lover album, which would spawn the singles It's No Crime, Tender Lover, Whip Appeal, and My Kind of Girl. We'd also have to highlight Heavy D and the Boys' Big Time album, which would spawn the singles We Got Our Own Thing, Somebody For Me, Girls They Love Me, and Big Time. The Michelle album entitled Michelle was also very successful, spawning the hit singles No More Lies, Nicety, Keep Watching, Something in My Heart, and If, even though the bulk of this album era would actually be in 1990. We could also highlight Queen Latifah's All Hail the Queen album, which would spawn the singles Wrath of My Madness, Dance For Me, Ladies First, Come Into My House, and Mama Gave Birth to the Soul Children. And we can't forget Janet Jackson's Rhythm Nation 1814, which would spawn the hit singles Miss You Much, Rhythm Nation, Escapade, All Right, Come Back to Me, Black Cat, and Love Will Never Do Without You. Even in 2025, this album still holds the record for being the only album to have 7 top 5 singles from one project, with 4 of those singles eventually becoming #1 hits, and leading to the fact that Janet Jackson would eventually become the first woman nominated for Producer of the Year at the Grammys. And again, the bulk of this album's success would actually be in 1990. Sonically, when we talk about a lot of the songs that were released in 88 and 89, you hear a different variety of sounds. Yes, there's a lot of New Jack Swing influenced music, but you still have somewhat of that Minneapolis sound, and you also have the sound of what Babyface was doing as a producer. And it was almost like all of those had kind of been blended together in its own hybrid kind of mix of a New Jack Swing, R&B, very high energy kind of sound. And we'd also see that during this era, there were lots of R&B mid-tempos and slow jams that were also very successful. This is how we got songs like I'll Be Sure, Night and Day, and New Edition, Can You Stand the Rain. During 1988 and 1989, we'd hear a lot more songs that had that industrial sound when it came to the drum kits being used, because just like with production, things always evolve, and new drum kits were being introduced within the production of a lot of the songs, and so the sound was becoming even more expansive between 88 and 89. When I say industrial, it would kind of be like the drums you hear on Babyface's It's No Crime, or Janet Jackson's Miss You Much. A very big sound with a lot of reverb and echo in the drum kits. It's almost like you're in a warehouse and somebody's playing the drums and that echo saturates throughout the warehouse. That's that industrial sound. In addition, we're starting to see the record labels start to spend a little bit more money when it comes to promotion and marketing for the R&B and hip-hop artists on their labels. In the past, the labels often would be a little bit skittish when it came to resources because they weren't sure if they would get their return on investment. But with massive albums like Bobby Brown's Don't Be Cruel or Janet Jackson's Rhythm Nation 1814, labels now understood that that sound was commercially appealing and could cross over to all audiences, not even just in the United States, but globally. Markets like Southeast Asia were heavily receptive to the New Jack Swing sound. It's also important to note that at the same time, house music is starting to have a resurgence commercially, and we're starting to see a lot of R&B and hip-hop acts get the best of both worlds, and not only New Jack Swing, but also in house, in addition to everything that was happening with R&B music and in hip-hop. And so we'd see hits like the Jungle Brothers' I'll House You. In addition, black music was expanding into so many realms creatively that sometimes there were acts where you couldn't even really categorize what their sound was. So an act like Public Enemy would have It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back. This album would consist of the singles Rebel Without a Pause, Bring the Noise, Don't Believe the Hype, Night of the Living Bassheads, and Black Steel in the Hour of Chaos. If you take the time to sit and listen through that album, you get so many sounds where there's a little bit of everything that's happening. And you start to see this with a lot of hip-hop albums because we're now starting to see the incorporation of samples as we come into 1990 and going into 1991. And so a lot of albums had so many things going on, and sometimes people didn't know what to categorize them as. It just all sounded really great, and it was one big party. During this time, we'd also start to see the normalization of the marriage between R&B and hip-hop/rap music. When we go back to the early 1980s, as hip-hop and rap were making its emergence, initially a lot of R&B stations were not fond of playing rap music or hip-hop because they felt, hey, this is not necessarily the genre we want to play. We want to stick to strictly R&B. Now, these stations today would be known as what you call adult R&B stations, or in the past, urban AC stations. And so for many, many years, there were many black radio stations that only played R&B soul. And eventually, some stations would start to say, okay, we'll play some of these rap songs later in the evening after 11 p.m. in a 1-hour block, here and there, so on and so forth. But a lot of times, there were a lot of R&B stations that were not playing rap music. And at the same time, there weren't a lot of rap stations yet. So a lot of rappers used to have to fight and claw to get exposure. When it came to television, both MTV and BET were initially skittish when it came to playing rap videos. And up until 1987, you could count on one hand how many rap videos were in regular rotation on MTV. Then in 1988, there was a one-time special hosted by Run DMC and DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince, and this special was entitled Yo MTV Raps. Now, this was supposed to just be one show, one and done, but the ratings were so high that they rivaled the ratings of the VMAs that year. This would lead to Yo MTV Raps becoming a staple on the MTV network, and there would be two versions of the show. There was a weekend edition and there was a weekday edition, and this was a 2-hour block of rap videos. Now, when it came to BET, they were still running under the scope of, hey, we're Ebony Magazine on television. We are highlighting the upper echelons of black society and success and progression. So that rap music and that hip hop thing is cool, but that's not necessarily what we want to highlight and showcase. However, because the ratings were so high for Yo MTV Raps, people at BET understood that they were missing out on a really, really important target demo. And so boom, we get the show Rap City in 1989. Before 1988, most rap videos were played on Video Music Box, a show that aired locally in New York City. So initially, when we were matriculating through 86 into 87 and 88 and going into 89, we were starting to see the influx of a lot of R&B songs that featured rappers, where instead of having a bridge, they would trade the idea for a bridge out and have a verse by a rapper. And on the flip side, when it came to rap music, we were starting to see a lot of rap songs where the hook would be sang by an R&B artist. And so when we go back to that conversation of what was happening with something like radio or even some of the television networks where they were strictly R&B soul, we don't want to play rap, or we have a no rap policy, now we're starting to see the influx of these songs where you're getting these collaborations. And a lot of these collaborations were taking place in New Jack Swing oriented songs. And so this would help to open the door where the networks and radio would be more receptive to the idea of hip hop, in addition to the idea of these New Jack Swing oriented collaborations. And a lot of what was happening with a lot of the radio stations that were starting to play New Jack Swing, where you were hearing both R&B and hip hop under a danceable beat, you start to see what would be the early origins of the rhythmic radio formats. That's the current format where sometimes you hear a little bit of everything, where you may hear pop, you may hear rap, you may hear a little bit of R&B, you may hear a little bit of dancehall, Afrobeat, even country pop crossover. Just picture a radio station that plays Sabrina Carpenter but also plays Kendrick Lamar. Those are normally rhythmic radio stations. And because New Jack Swing was such a high energy sound and often brought a lot of people to the dance floor, we were starting to see an increase in different acts that were incorporating choreography into their sets, into their music videos, into their live performances, and into their tours. Acts like a Janet Jackson, acts like Heavy D and Guy, Big Daddy Kane, Salt and Pepper, Kid and Play. Also, when we talk about what a lot of us like to label the Kid and Play dance, when you look at it, it's technically the Charleston, but just with two people instead of one. Remember, the Charleston was something that came out in 1903 that became very popular in the Black American South. So now we fast forward to the late 1980s, and here we are where something has evolved into something new, where again, when it comes to black music, black entertainment, black joy, black dancing, there's always that conversation of evolution. New Jack Swing was becoming so popular that even workplace training videos were utilizing it.
Soft drinks, lemonade, water, cold tea, it's up to you, it's up to me. Cold drinks come in 4 cups, gotta know the size before you fill it up. Biggie, medium, small, kids meal, keep it straight, it's a good deal. Use the scoop to fill with ice, never use the cup, take my advice.
Don't forget to smile when you serve cold drinks. Always say thank you to the guest.
And so when it came to the fashion, the hair, the shoes, the jewelry, the hats, there was no one definitive look that was there because it was ever changing. And a lot of times the looks matched the energy of the music. And also depending on what kind of entertainer you were. You may have been a member of the Native Tongues, so you had your own specific look. Or you might have been Kwame in the Only You video and it's all about polka dots, right? Or when it came to haircuts, you might have the Bobby Brown Gumby, or you might have the flat top like Kid and Play. And for some of the women, there were all kind of unique hairstyles, everything from the asymmetric haircut to different styles where depending on what side of the head you were looking at, you got something different with each turn. And so there were so many different options out there, but again, the stylings matched the energy of the music. And so even when it came to just suits, you know, you could take a group like Guy, where yeah, they wore suits, but these weren't the suits you were gonna wear to work, right? These are suits you wore to the club. So you can take Al B. Sure, Guy, Bobby Brown, and they all got something different going on. We were now in an era where when it came to the label, it wasn't all about being super polished and presentable to be marketable for all audiences. It was more so, can you bring us the authenticity of where it is you come from and present it on stage, present it in music video, present it in the magazines? Can you just be you? 1990 to 1992 would serve as the most transformative era for New Jack Swing, and 1990 would actually serve as the peak of New Jack Swing when it came to chart placements. By this point, New Jack Swing was the say-all, be-all, and end-all if you wanted a chance and a possibility of some traction on the charts as a rapper and as an R&B act. Even the seasoned acts at this point were hopping on to the sound. Patti LaBelle would have singles like Feels Like Another One, Aretha Franklin would have the single What You See Is What You Sweat, and Gladys Knight would have the song Meet Me in the Middle.
Now, Diana Ross, superstar diva, is back in a big way.
As an artist, you see, I can't just do ballads and beautiful pop songs, even though I do that and I like to do that. You want to stay with what's happening currently in the music business. And I just think it's really what I like.
What's really unique about this 1990 to 1992 time frame is that this is the most transformative period for New Jack Swing because the sound constantly evolved, and there's not really, again, one distinctive sound that defines this time frame, because you can have a song like Ralph Tresvant's Sensitivity from 1990, but at the same time, just 2 years later, there's a song like TLC's Ain't Too Proud to Beg, or in the same year, SWV's I'm So Into You, which is a total 180 from Mary J. Blige's Real Love and Jade Don't Walk Away, where I will say those two songs just mentioned are so unconventional in the realm of New Jack Swing that some people would question, do they even classify as New Jack Swing songs because of just the way that the production is set up? But then again, you have other songs like Bobby Brown's Humpin' Around and Johnny Gill's Fairweather Friend. This was just a time period where the sound expansion of New Jack Swing was going into so many different creative directions that for a lot of people who are really big fans of New Jack Swing, some would say that this was a really great era production-wise because there were so many options and there was such a mass variety of different sounds you could get into. Now, there is no way I can name every single viable hit that came out of 1990 with this sound just because there were so many. But we're going to try to get through as many of these as we can. So again, don't fight me if your song was not mentioned. There's just that many. Also, some of these songs may have been on an album that was released the year previously, but I was trying to highlight when the song was actually charting. So sometimes a year and a release date may not match up. That's for this entire video, by the way. There were songs like Johnny Gill, Fairweather Friend, In Vogue, Lies, Jane Child, Don't Wanna Fall in Love, Today, I Got a Feeling, Truth, Spread My Wings, In Vogue, Hold On, After 7, Can't Stop, Tony, Feels Good, Babyface, My Kind of Girl, Ralph Tresvant, Sensitivity, Belle Biv DeVoe, Poison, Pebbles, Giving You the Benefit, Whitney Houston, My Name Is Not Susan, and I'm Your Baby Tonight, Father MC, Treat 'Em Like They Want to Be Treated, The Good Girls, I Need Your Love, Guy, Wanna Get With You, High Five, Just Can't Handle It, Climax, Good Love, LL Cool J, Jinglin' Baby, LL Cool J, Roundaway Girl, Loose Ends, Don't Be a Fool, Mariah Carey, Someday, MC Trouble, I Wanna Make You Mine, MC Trouble, Gotta Get a Grip, Michelle A, Nicety, Moni Love, It's a Shame, Salt and Pepper, Independent, Salt and Pepper, Expression, Samuel, So You Like What You See, Tevin Campbell, Round and Round, Today, Why You Get Funky on Me, Tribe Called Quest, Description of a Fool, Digital Underground, Humpty Dance. And again, that's not every song that was released during 1990, but it highlights just how expansive New Jack Swing has become, because if we just backtrack to 1987, the three notable New Jack Swing hits were Keith Sweat, I Want Her, and Kool Moe Dee, Wild Wild West, and How You Like Me Now. Now we fast forward to 1990, and there's this long string of hits where we could have kept going. If there were some albums to highlight from 1990, we definitely have to highlight Johnny Gill's Johnny Gill album, which would spawn the singles Rub You the Right Way, My, Fairweather Friend, and Wrap My Body Tight. We'd also have to definitely credit In Vogue's Born to Sing album, which would have the singles Hold On, Lies, You Don't Have to Worry, and Don't Go. Tony's Revival album that would have the singles The Blues, Oakland Stroke, Feels Good, It Never Rains in Southern California, and Whatever You Want. We'd also have to highlight Belle Biv DeVoe's Poison album with the singles Poison, Do Me, BBD I Thought It Was Me, When Will I See You Smile Again, and She's Dope. By the way, one of my favorite remixes ever was the She's Dope remix. We'd also have to highlight Father MC's Father's Day album that would also have the singles Treat Them Like They Want to Be Treated, I'll Do For You. That single would also feature a young Mary J. Blige who would be introduced to the world through that music video, Lisa Baby, and I've Been Watching You. A lot of the New Jack Swing songs in 1990 were very hard-hitting and in your face, or they could be relatively smooth and an easy groove. So you could have songs very aggressive like a Belle Biv DeVoe Poison or a Tony Feels Good, but on the other end you could have songs very smooth like a Ralph Tresvant Sensitivity, where the drum beat is still very hard hitting and you could dance to it just as hard as you would a Kid and Play song. However, because the chords are so smooth and the stacked vocals are very tranquil, some people look at this as more of a late night, mid-tempo, almost slow jam kind of song, when in reality it's still the same tempo as many of the other New Jack Swing tracks. And so 1990 was a very creative year where we were starting to get so many different sounds. Moni Love could drop a single like It's a Shame, but at the same time, Troop would have a song like Spread My Wings. As for 1991, this would serve as the year where many of the songs had the fastest BPM out of all the New Jack Swing songs ever released. You had songs like Boyz II Men, Motown Philly, Heavy D, Now That We Found Love, and Patti LaBelle, Feels Like Another One. When it came to 1991, you'd have songs like Guys, Do Me Right, Jodeci, Gotta Love, Ralph Tresvant, Stone Cold Gentleman, The OJs, Don't Let Me Down, Damian Dane, Right Down to It, Karen White, The Way I Feel About You, Heavy D, Is It Good to You, Johnny Gill, Wrap My Body Tight, Boyz II Men, Motown Philly, Pebbles featuring Salt and Pepper, Backyard, Karen White, Romantic, Gladys Knight, Men, Phyllis Hyman, Don't Want to Change the World, Shanice, I Like Your Smile, Jasmine Guy, Another Like My Love, Christopher Williams, I'm Dreamin', Keisha Jackson, Mature Love, and Mama Told Me. High Five, I Like the Way, The Kissing Game, Jeff Redd, You Called and Told Me, Color Me Bad, I Wanna Sex You Up, Ex-Girlfriend, You're the One for Me, Heavy D, Now That We Found Love, Keith Sweat, Keep It Comin', Kid and Play, Ain't Gonna Hurt Nobody, MC Brains, Oochie Coochie, Prince, Get Off, Queen Latifah, Latifah's Had It Up to Here, Ralph Tresvant, Yo Baby Yo, Salt and Pepper, Do You Want Me, Sounds of Blackness, Optimistic, Tevin Campbell, Just Ask Me To, and Strawberry Letter 23, Troop, For the Love of Money, Vanessa Williams, The Comfort Zone, and Running Back to You, Yo-Yo, You Can't Play With My Yo-Yo, Digital Underground, Kiss You Back, Chubb Rock, Treat 'Em Right, Digital Underground, same song, Another Bad Creation, Playground. If we're talking New Jack Swing albums from 1991, we definitely have to highlight Tevin Campbell's T-E-V-I-N album. Personally, I've always felt that this was one of the best albums to come out of 1991, period. Very, very underrated. I know we love Can We Talk, but there were some gems on that T-E-V-I-N album. This album would spawn the singles Round and Round, Just Ask Me To, Tell Me What You Want Me to Do, Goodbye, Strawberry Letter 23, Alone With You, Confused, and One Song. Jodeci's Forever My Lady album. This album would spawn the singles Gotta Love, Forever My Lady, Stay, Come and Talk to Me, I'm Still Waiting. Now some may say this isn't necessarily a fully New Jack Swing album, it's more so R&B, but Jodeci is a group that's born out of the era of New Jack Swing in regard to everything that was happening with Uptown Records at the time. The New Jack City soundtrack, which would feature the singles I'm Dreamin' and I Wanna Sex You Up, but would also feature songs by Ice-T, Guy, Johnny Gill, Keith Sweat, Danny Madden, the song For the Love of Money and Living for the City that would feature Troop, Levert, and Queen Latifah, Essence, FS Effect, and 2 Live Crew. The Cooley Harmony album from Boyz II Men with the hit singles Motown Philly, It's So Hard to Say Goodbye to Yesterday, Ooh Ah, Please Don't Go, End of the Road, and In the Still of the Night I Remember. The Comfort Zone from Vanessa Williams with the singles Running Back to You, The Comfort Zone, Save the Best for Last, Just for Tonight, and Work to Do. And of course, we can't talk about New Jack Swing albums from 1991 without mentioning the best-selling New Jack Swing album of all time, Michael Jackson Dangerous, which would feature the hits Black or White, Remember the Time, In the Closet, Jam, one of my personal favorites, Who Is It, Heal the World, Give In to Me, Will You Be There, and Gone Too Soon. And then we get to 1992, where again, some of the notable hits would be Lorenzo Smith, Real Love, Melissa Morgan, Can You Feel What I Want, I'll Be Sure Right Now, Babyface and Toni Braxton, Give You My Heart, Ralph Tresvant, Money Can't Buy Love, TLC, Ain't Too Proud to Beg, Brian McKnight, Goodbye My Love, Bobby Brown, Good Enough, TLC, What About Your Friends, In Vogue, My Lovin', Keith Sweat, Keep It Comin', High Five, She's Playing Hard to Get, Public Announcement, She's Got That Vibe, Tisha Campbell, Love Me Down, Aaron Hall, Don't Be Afraid, After 7, Kicking It, Mary J. Blige, You Remind Me, Mary J. Blige, Real Love, CeCe Peniston, Keep On Walking, In Vogue, Give It Up, Turn It Loose, Father MC, One Night Stand, Grace Jones, 7 Day Weekend, Janet Jackson, Luther Vandross, and Belle Biv DeVoe, The Best Things in Life Are Free, Joe Public, Live and Learn, Mary J. Blige, You Remind Me, MC Hammer, Gaining Momentum, Men at Large, Use Me, Naughty by Nature, Uptown Anthem, Portrait, Here We Go, Positive K, I Got a Man, Prince, My Name is Prince, Silk, Happy Days, TLC, Hat to the Back, Tribe Called Quest, Hot Sex, Rex in Effect, Rump Shaker, and Tisha Campbell, Push. 1992 was a really great year for New Jack Swing oriented albums, especially albums that were saturated in R&B, and especially with a lot of the releases that were from women in music. And so it was really hard to try to condense this down to 3 or 4 albums just because there were that many, so I had a few more. What I tried to do was utilize or highlight the albums that had multiple crossover singles that were commercially successful. I didn't name all of them, but here are just a few. You have the Mo Money soundtrack, which would spawn the singles Money Can't Buy Love from Ralph Tresvant, The Best Things in Life Are Free from Janet Jackson, Luther Vandross, and Belle Biv DeVoe, I Adore You from Karen Wheeler, Let's Just Get Together, So Groovy Now from Crush, Ice Cream Dream from MC Lyte, Joy from Sounds of Blackness, and Forever Love from Color Me Bad. You also had the Boomerang soundtrack with Give You My Heart from Babyface and Toni Braxton, End of the Road from Boyz II Men, I Die Without You from PM Dawn, Love Should Have Brought You Home from Toni Braxton, 7 Day Weekend from Grace Jones, and Hot Sex from Tribe Called Quest. You also had the Bobby album from Bobby Brown, which would spawn the hits Humpin' Around, Good Enough, Get Away, That's the Way Love Is, Something in Common with Whitney Houston, and Two Can Play That Game. When it came to the women, you had Funky Divas from In Vogue with the singles My Lovin' You're Never Gonna Get It, Giving Him Something He Can Feel, Free Your Mind, Give It Up, Turn It Loose, and Love Don't Love You. Jade's Jade to the Max with the singles I Wanna Love You, Don't Walk Away, One Woman, and Looking for Mr. Do-Right. What's the 411 from Mary J. Blige with the singles You Remind Me, Real Love, Reminisce, Sweet Thing, and Love No Limit. TLC's Ooh on the TLC tip with the singles Ain't Too Proud to Beg, Baby Baby Baby, What About Your Friends, and Hat to the Back. And SWV's It's About Time with the singles Right Here, I'm So Into You, Weak, Downtown, the re-release / remix of Right Here with the Human Nature mix, You're Always on My Mind, and Anything. 1992 would serve as the year where again New Jack Swing would jump into so many different directions that it's kind of hard to define its distinctive sound in 1992, which is why we have songs like a Mary J. Blige Real Love, where again it's not really one of the conventional sounding New Jack Swing songs based on the production style of what had been happening in the previous years. The same can be said for Jade's Don't Walk Away, where in this song a lot of the emphasis is in the power of the chords versus the power of the drum. Many New Jack Swing songs always have very hard-hitting drums and soft chords, but a song like Jade's Don't Walk Away, even when you hear the opening, what you're hearing are those very in-your-face chords.
Here we go! Pump it up, y'all! Oh, yeah! Jade's in the head!
And of course the beat is still gonna thump and there's the emphasis on that cowbell, but with Jade's Don't Walk Away, it just really sounds different compared to something just like Belle Biv DeVoe's Poison from 2 years earlier.
Yo, Brett, yeah. What you got, homie? Yeah, you ready to ride, homie? You ready, Biv? Oh, I'm ready, Snake Eye,
So New Jack Swing, like we were saying, just continued to evolve into so many different realms where it couldn't just be categorized into one sound, which is why it lasted for so long and had so many different artists that were able to benefit from its sound. TLC could have the very aggressive and in-your-face Ain't Too Proud to Beg, and Michael Jackson could have the very smooth Remember the Time and In the Closet. Television was very important when it came to marketing for a lot of acts during the New Jack Swing era. Award shows like the NAACP Awards and the Soul Train Awards would serve as outlets for artists to present their music to larger audiences, and a lot of times when it came to breaking in an act, tons of acts that eventually would go on to have a string of hits would often make their television debut on shows like Soul Train, Showtime at the Apollo, and the Arsenio Hall Show. One of the cool things about watching reruns of Soul Train and Showtime at the Apollo between about 1988 to about 92 is that you often saw many acts that you've never heard of. Where again, when we're talking about New Jack Swing, even in this episode, we're talking about the hits that were able to chart and do well. But there were tons of artists that also released songs that may not have necessarily gained the traction to become viable hits. And so sometimes when you're watching the reruns, you'll see acts and artists that you've never heard of, even when you were around to remember this time period. This was an era where there were lots of record labels. Not everybody was owned by the same 2 or 3 major corporations. There were tons and tons of record labels. There were tons of independent record labels. There were tons of mom and pop record labels where they only had one artist and they really needed that artist to get on in order for the label to stay up. And so sometimes they weren't able to book TV appearances on MTV or BET or the major award shows. But Showtime at the Apollo would take them. Soul Train would take them. And so we often saw a lot of artists get their breakout start on shows like Showtime at the Apollo and Soul Train. One of the other things when we start talking about the Arsenio Hall show and Showtime at the Apollo is that the bar was set really high when it came to live performances. Even when we talk Showtime at the Apollo, the crowd sometimes would even boo the featured act. If you've ever seen the reruns, you normally see the booing during amateur night. However, on some episodes, if the feature comedian was not that great, they got booed. And even the feature live performer, if they weren't necessarily great, the crowd could either give them dead silence and sometimes they also would boo. And so the standard was set high and a lot of people took these outlets very seriously when they got an opportunity for placements. And when we get to something like the Arsenio Hall show, oftentimes, some acts that never even would perform with a live band would have a live band for the Arsenio Hall show because the standard on the show was set really high when it came to live performances. This is why acts like a Tevin Campbell, when he would make his debut on the Arsenio Hall show, would have Prince's entire band, the New Power Generation, to back him as he would perform the single Round and Round. Even acts like Milli Vanilli understood that after the public humiliation of being found out as an act that didn't sing any of their initial songs, when they went back in the studio and recorded a new album with their own vocals, they knew the one show they had to go on if they wanted a viable chance at ever getting in the good graces of the public would be the Arsenio Hall show. The Arsenio Hall show was able to capture and showcase just how energetic New Jack Swing could be when it's performed live with a full band and dancers and an engaging audience. Also, by the time you get to 1990, you start hearing the incorporation of a lot more sampling within the music, where the sound is starting to get more and more creative. That was one of the highlights of New Jack Swing after 1990, was that even though these songs are very melodic, a lot of times they would have multiple samples mixed in where you got a little bit of everything. And so a lot of the R&B songs that didn't even have any rappers on them would still have a very hip-hop and rap influenced sound, even though the songs were strictly R&B. BET's Video Soul was also a crucial outlet when it came to exposure for a lot of artists during the New Jack Swing era. The familiarity of host Donnie Simpson and later down the line Sherry Carter would make it comfortable for a lot of older viewers to get in tune with some of the newer acts that were being presented on the show. This was one of the outlets that helped New Jack Swing to cross over generationally. During the New Jack Swing era, a lot of rappers also had a very percussive approach to the delivery of their verses, where, again, when we talk about everything that happens between that 1 and the 4, you had some rappers that were so gifted lyrically when it came to delivery that they could play all kind of games between the 1 and the 4 and do all kind of things that were rhythmically challenging, but still land on the 4 perfectly at the end of all their stanzas. And so you'd have different songs like Heavy D's Now That We Found Love or MC Trouble's Gotta Get a Grip, where again, the rappers were almost rapping in this percussive style where it's almost like the lyrics are dancing out of their mouth, if that makes any sense. New Jack Swing at this point was so massive that its influence was starting to bleed into the other genres. Even if we just jump back to 1987, when you're talking about big pop hits, you had songs like Debbie Gibson's Shake Your Love, right? Very whimsical, very bright, very middle America, let's go to the mall. Then we just fast forward a few years later, you have acts like Alanis Morissette, where her debut album is more of a New Jack Swing album. Yes, the very same Alanis Morissette that gave us Jagged Little Pill with You Oughta Know and Ironic and You Learn. Her 1991 album Alanis would be very New Jack Swing oriented, and she would cite Janet Jackson as one of her biggest influences for the project. You'd also get songs like Glenn Medario's She's Not Worth It in 1990 that would also feature Bobby Brown. By the time we get to those early 1990s, New Jack Swing is everywhere. It carries influence, it carries impact. It's to the point where even on the Mickey Mouse Club and Kids Incorporated, a lot of the performances were of New Jack Swing songs. during this time period, house music was still really popular, and we were starting to see a lot of crossover house acts like CNC Music Factory, Black Box, and Crystal Waters. Even Whitney Houston's I'm Every Woman would be a massive house hit. This would also play a role into how New Jack Swing was received over in Europe. Europe was a very interesting market because there were some countries that really enjoyed the New Jack Swing sound. However, many countries in Europe preferred the house sound. So oftentimes, labels would take their singles that were released in the United States as New Jack Swing tracks and remix them specifically for releases in Europe. We'd see that with Whitney Houston's I'm Your Baby Tonight single, where the US would have a version, but the UK and Europe would get more of a dance/house version. Patti LaBelle would have the New Jack Swing version of Feels Like Another One for the United States. But overseas, there was more of the dance house version. Tevin Campbell's Strawberry Letter 23 again would have that New Jack Swing release in the United States. However, in Europe and the UK, they would have the more dance house version. By the way, I'm still pissed that on Spotify, they don't have the New Jack Swing version of this song. It's only the house one, and it doesn't hit the same way. Fortunately, I have the real CD, but you know when you're streaming in the car, I don't have time to be trying to dig up CDs and end up in a ditch while I'm driving. Even Janet Jackson's Best Things in Life Are Free with Luther Vandross and Belle Biv DeVoe. What was interesting is, the United States got the New Jack Swing version, but Europe again and the UK got the dance/house version. And when we're talking about Janet Jackson, Rhythm Nation, the album, was massive in the United States. However, when we look at a place like the UK, it was only a moderate hit. So then when we get to the single Best Things in Life Are Free, and they get that house dance version, that's actually her second biggest hit in the UK of all time, next to That's the Way Love Goes. The Things That You Do by DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince would also be another song that had that similar experience. So that just goes to show how different segments of the world responded to New Jack Swing versus house. The gift of New Jack Swing was the fact that it was music that made a lot of people dance, and so with a lot of rappers, this was an era where rappers really put a lot of emphasis on getting you to dance. Yes, they could still drop great lyrics, they could make you think, but they really liked to make music that could get people on the dance floor. And so we saw a lot of rappers that had music that was very dance friendly, whether it was centered and saturated in New Jack Swing or centered and saturated in house music. Some of these acts would include rappers like Redhead Kingpin, Heavy D, MC Trouble, Young MC, Digital Underground, Queen Latifah, Moni Love, Big Daddy Kane, Kid and Play, Salt and Pepper, LL Cool J, MC Brains, MC Hammer, Rex and Effect, Rob Bass and DJ Easy Rock, and Chubb Rock, just to name a few. New Jack Swing would have such a dynamic impact in music and culture that it was starting to even be saturated in everyday conversations, as well as what we saw in television. We had shows like In Living Color, where again, the celebration of black life and culture would be presented in a sketch variety show form, but the theme song would be straight up New Jack Swing, to the point where there were two theme songs and both of them hit differently, but they both go in. Sitcoms like The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Hanging with Mr. Cooper, A Different World, Martin, and later Living Single would go on to be shows that not only had theme songs that were New Jack Swing oriented, but often would have different entertainers that were really popular during the New Jack Swing era. We often got treated to many different performances from many New Jack Swing acts on a lot of these sitcoms. The Oprah Show at one point even had a New Jack Swing oriented theme song. And this didn't just stop with television, because New Jack Swing also influenced a lot of different movies. We get films like New Jack City, Class Act, Boomerang, Just Another Girl in the IRT. Films like Bebe's Kids, and the House Party franchise. Fun fact, House Party initially was supposed to star DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince, aka Will Smith. If we jump back to 1990, they released the song Nightmare on My Street, and then ended up being sued by New Line Cinemas because they said, hey, this is copyright infringement on our film Nightmare on Elm Street. So once the case was settled, the video was yanked from television, and New Line Cinema said, actually, you know what? As a way to pay back your debt to what you still owe us off of this settlement, how about you guys star in this movie we're trying to create called House Party? They ended up turning it down, and we ended up getting Kid and Play. This was also during the same time period that we would see the development of the show The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Again, after the release of And This Corner in 1989, and it was not a very successful album, even though it did have the single that I liked, specifically I Think I Can Beat Mike Tyson, Will Smith and Jazzy Jeff ran into some financial trouble. This is how we got into the conversation where there were different meetings and phone calls, and soon we saw the development of the show The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. The House Party franchise would go on to be very successful and indirectly serve as the face of house parties during the New Jack Swing era. They'd also eventually have their own cartoon as far as Kid and Play, and there was also a cartoon that MC Hammer had called Hammerman. And speaking of children, the success of New Jack Swing made it very easy for a lot of labels to start pushing younger acts into the music business as far as kid performers. And so we see the emergence of acts like Another Bad Creation, The Boys, High Five, Tevin Campbell, even Raven Simone. Now, one of the things that you couldn't deny about New Jack Swing was that it was unapologetically black. Everything from the sound, the culture, the dancing, this was something that just couldn't be emulated by everybody. Either you had it or you didn't. And one of the downsides was that many music critics did not like New Jack Swing. Many publications often ridiculed it as a dismissive sound and genre that was fluff. It was just something for people to dance to. There was no meaning, no messaging behind any of the music. And so a lot of artists out of this era were often dismissed by music critics. The perfect example would even be the opening intro on TLC's On the TLC Tip album, where you hear the guy talking about their fashion and their style, and he says that line about, I'm not into that. I think it's kind of lame. It's just one of those black things that the people get into. Right? Even when you look at something like Whitney Houston's I'm Your Baby Tonight album, a lot of critics didn't like it because they thought, okay, this is a little too black for us. You need to go back to what you were doing on the Whitney album. We want some more so emotionals and Where Do Broken Hearts Go? And you're giving us My Name Is Not Susan and anymore. We don't want that. What are you doing? And another example would even be the premiere of Michael Jackson's Remember the Time video. In a lot of black households, this video has always been a gem. This has always been one of the staples in the Michael catalog. However, critics hated the song and the video, and the video was dragged in the media the day after it premiered, even though it would still be a big hit. By the time we get to 1993 going into 94 and 95, we see a major shift with what's happening in music. And as far as New Jack Swing, we're starting to see a slowdown, not only commercially, but even with the sound and the production. Things really just start to slow down. Like we were talking about with 1990 going into 1992. It was a very, very expansive time for New Jack Swing where lots of new producers, lots of new sounds have branched into different categories. Now we know when we talk about New Jack Swing and we like to give our credit, the majority of the credit we love to give to Teddy Riley, we like to give a little bit to Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, some to Babyface, some to these additional producers, but now we're coming into a space where there are so many new faces that are in the production booth making different sounds and putting different things out there. And because 90 going into 92 was such an expansive and unique time when it came to variety, there are so many different trajectories that the music went into as far as that sonic sound that was going to be there. And so by the time we get to 1993, there's no one distinctive sound of what's supposed to be happening, but what we do know is that the sounds were shifting and things were changing. And like I've said before, when we talk about a song like a Mary J. Blige, Real Love, and a Jay, Don't Walk Away, those two songs are so different compared to what was happening just a few years earlier that, again, they open a Pandora's box into a new territory. And so 93, 94, 95 would serve as eras where music went into new territory.
The first album, not only was the colors bright, but the messages hit you like that. The music was a faster tempo, so everything on the first album was more hype than it is now. From clothes, music, the sound, to everything.
So for this next set of highlights, I'm going to merge 93 and 94 together. I'm going to bypass 1995 because by 95, New Jack Swing has gone on to glory. Not because it has died, but just because it has evolved and turned into so many different elements of R&B and hip-hop that there are new sounds that are out there. 93 would give us Mary J. Blige, You Don't Have to Worry, Shantae Moore, Who Do I Turn To, Christopher Williams, Every Little Thing You Do, Intro, Let Me Be the One, Mary J. Blige, Reminisce, Alexander O'Neal, If You Let It, Janet If, Janet Because of Love, Joe, The One For Me, Johnny Gill on the Floor, Naughty by Nature, Hip Hop Array, Portrait, Honey Dip, The Real Seduction, Ain't Nothing Wrong, Sounds of Blackness, I'm Going All the Way, TLC, Get It Up, Tony, If I Had No Loot, Usher, Call Me a Mac, and Belle Biv DeVoe, Gangsta. And 94 would have Ralph Tresvant, When I Need Somebody, Angela Winbush, Treat You Right, Blackstreet, Baby Be Mine, Heavy D, Nothing But Love, Janet, You Want This, Layla Hathaway, Let Me Love You, Patti LaBelle, Right Kind of Lover, Toni Braxton, I Belong to You, Tony, My Ex-Girlfriend, and Escape Love on My Mind. And like I said, by the time we get to 1995, the sound has evolved into so many different spaces where New Jack Swing can't even really be categorized anymore. But if we wanted to highlight one song from 95, we could highlight Tony Thompson's I Wanna Love Like That. One of the lessons to take from this era when we're talking 93 onward is that it's important to understand that trends evolve, right? Trends will be popular, but because they're so popular and so many are invested in them, new ideas come, and those new ideas form new ideas that become the next trend. And that's kind of what happened with New Jack Swing. One of the things that always used to get under my skin, especially in modern times when I think back to Bruno Mars releasing Finesse, and some people were saying this is a conversation of cultural appropriation, and a lot of people would respond to that and say, no, because black people abandoned New Jack Swing. And it was like, no, they didn't abandon New Jack Swing. New Jack Swing just took a new form and expanded into something else. Take the production style of somebody like a Teddy Riley. When we go back to 87 with Keith Sweat, I Want Her, the style is very funky, very big orchestra hits, very, very danceable. We jump a few years, we get to something like a Michael Jackson, Remember the Time, and it's a smooth groove. It's a New Jack Swing song, but it's very smooth. It's not as hard-hitting and in your face as a Keith Sweat, I Want Her, but it's because it's reflective of the time that we're in. And then even when you fast forward to his later productions, something like Blackstreet's No Diggity, very, very different, and it's because as a producer, and as a creative person, you're constantly working to evolve your sound and try new things because you eventually get bored doing exactly the same thing every year. And so when you look at a lot of the Blackstreet productions, songs like Joy, very, very different for somebody like a Teddy Riley, but also it highlights and showcases that when it comes to musical creativity, there are no limitations. And so as we transition from the early into the mid 1990s, there were so many things that had taken place in the music industry. We had the emergence of gangsta rap, which really did do a number on a lot of the rappers that were deemed New Jack Swing rappers. And so a lot of rappers that really thrived during the peak of New Jack Swing were starting to be seen as the old guard when it came to what was happening in current music at that point in time. And even a lot of the commercial acts that had crossover appeal, their sound had even slowed down. So when we take something like an In Vogue, yes, they had songs like My Love and You're Never Gonna Get It, and songs like that, but we just fast forward a little bit further down the line, and now we're getting songs like Runaway Love. Janet Jackson had us foot working to All Right, but now she's giving us That's the Way Love Goes. And even when you listen to other songs from the Janet album like If, they're very different for New Jack Swing, where now we have the incorporation of lots of guitars and all kind of additional samples and different things where something like Janet Jackson If sounds so different sonically from a song like Belle Biv DeVoe, Poison. We were just spinning on our head the TLC's What About Your Friends, and now we're getting a smooth TLC Creep and Waterfalls. Mary had us bopping to Real Love, and now she's giving us songs like Be Happy, still a party song, very different from just a few years earlier. And so we see how their sounds change. Keith Sweat is no longer giving us all the party tracks and the Keep It Comings, now he's giving us Get Up On It, and later down the line we'd get songs like Nobody and Twisted. Heavy D, who gave us Now That We Found Love, which for me, I've always said if you could ever have a combination of a house and a New Jack Swing song, Now That We Found Love was that song. Now we're going from that to Nothing But Love. And his later collaboration with Monifa, I Miss You.
Yeah, Versace, Gucci, crazy Lucci. Hey, if you're gonna jam with me on stage. I got nothing but love for you.
The beauty of music is that it's something that's constantly evolving and reshaping. And unfortunately, in the music business, if you're not able to grow with the trend or evolve, sometimes you become encapsulated to specific eras in music. And so for many artists that emerged during the peak of New Jack Swing, if they weren't able to discover a new trend or try something different as that trend was changing, a lot of them got lost in the shuffle and became encapsulated into the New Jack Swing era. And around this time, we were starting to see again the popularity of regional sounds starting to influence what was going to happen nationally. So you had the Atlanta sound that was taking place and everything that was happening with LaFace Records. You had the Miami bass sound and everything that would happen with acts like the 69 Boys and later down the line the Quad City DJs, even though they were from Jacksonville. The West Coast was starting to do its thing. In hip hop, we were getting new artists that were coming out with new sounds and different elements that were very innovative. R&B was expanding into different territories, and so we were getting saturated with so many new options to indulge in. And so even though people loved New Jack Swing and it was a great time, the sound had evolved into many different new sounds, and the origins of what was happening during New Jack Swing had spread and grown into what the current trends were now. So even when we talk about that marriage between R&B and hip hop during the New Jack Swing era, it was still happening, but now it's taking new forms. And now we're getting songs like Method Man and Mary J. Blige, You're All I Need, LL Cool J and Total, Loungin', the Fugees, Killing Me Softly. Lots of the producers that gave us the sounds that we enjoyed during the New Jack Swing era never went anywhere. Their sounds just evolved. Babyface, who gave us lots of danceable tracks for artists like Karen White and Pebbles, and his solo work, is now giving us stuff that's a lot smoother and in a more subtle pocket. He's collaborating with John B, and we're getting songs like Someone to Love. He's collaborating with Tony Braxton, and now we're getting songs like Another Sad Love Song and Breathe Again, giving Tony Braxton her first Billboard #1 single with You're Making Me High. He's producing entire movie soundtracks like Waiting to Exhale, and creating blockbuster ballads with Boyz II Men. Eddie F, who was there for the journey with Heavy D and the Boys, would go on to work and produce with many different artists and many acts, and give us hits like You Know What's Up by Donald Jones and Left Eye. Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis would continue to produce a string of hits even in modern times. The members of Full Force would continue to produce for many different acts, even scoring top 10 hits with groups like the Backstreet Boys, and landing placements with NSYNC. Foster and McElroy would continue to work with different acts, and even come into the 2000s working with artists like Jay-Z. The New Jack Swing era in music would go on to serve as a very innovative time period in music, and it would serve as the building blocks to what we would see with regard to the massive success of R&B and hip-hop in the 90s and 2000s. And so like I said at the beginning of this video, New Jack Swing was explosive, and even in modern times, its influence still saturates within the current music industry. And so acts that are now in their 50s and 60s can still find their way on world stages because so many people love the nostalgia of what was during that time period of what you call the heyday of New Jack Swing. New Jack Swing gave people permission to have a good time and enjoy themselves, step outside of the box, and sweat it out all night on the dance floor. And so for a lot of people, New Jack Swing serves as an era of a good time. For me, it's childhood nostalgia. It's the memories of having a windbreaker suit and pretending to be a member of Another Bad Creation at the playground. It's the memories of going to the neighborhood cookouts and the parents made you get in the middle of the dance circle and showed them that dance that you learned from the TV. And the dance that you learned was something you saw Michael Jackson doing on Video Soul. It's the memory of just enjoying how everything just felt really free at the time and people like to dance and enjoy themselves. And so it serves its purpose for everybody for different reasons who were able to remember that era when it was out. And I love that so many people have discovered a lot of the songs who weren't around for that time period. With the emergence of things like YouTube and TikTok and Instagram and Twitter, people always find new things. And so it's always great to see people kind of go back and either relive or rediscover or discover a lot of the gems that came out of that era. So yeah, that's our New Jack Swing conversation. Let me know what your favorite songs were, your favorite albums, your favorite artists, your favorite tours, if you had a favorite performance. There's so much that I wish I could include in this, but you know how YouTube does when it comes to copyright strikes, so I had to tread carefully with how I was going to edit this. And again, I was not able to feature every single artist and act, so I'm sure there's a song or two that I skipped. Forgive me if I did. I tried my best, people. But you can definitely add those songs that we should also celebrate and incorporate in the comments section. Anyway, I'm out. Share your 2 cents. Subscribe.